they're going to work this case. They're going to look at every aspect and try to figure out the exact cause. The DNA federal agents pulled out of Gene Hackman's secret tunnel does not match what the public was told about how he died. It matches him. His own biological trace still fresh pressed into the gears of a hidden mechanical lock during the final 7 days of his life. A window in which a 95-year-old man in cardiac decline was officially bedridden, disoriented, dying of grief. He was not. He was working, and what the DNA proves he was working on 40 feet. Beneath his own library floor is the reason this case was buried inside ours. It works against him because it cannot be explained any other way. The story nobody questioned when Gene Hackman was found dead at his $4 million estate in the hills above Santa Fe. The official explanation almost wrote itself. He was 95. His wife, Betsy Arakawa, was 65, and she had already died 7 days earlier from a severe viral infection. Gene's death was listed as heart failure with Alzheimer's as a contributing factor. An elderly man, isolated in grief, withdrawing from the world until his heart finally gave out. The narrative was clean. It was human. It was wrong. Here's what that means. For most of the public, even the immediate appearance of federal agents at the property barely registered body. Camera footage showed deputies discovering Arakawa's body in a bathroom. Hackman was found collapsed near the front door. Yeah, he's down. He's been down for a while. Yeah. The FBI presence was waved off as standard protocol for high-profile estates where ownership changes hands unexpectedly. The heavy steel gates, the motion sensors, the thermal cameras. Along the outer walls, all dismissed as the eccentricities of a Hollywood legend who had spent decades fending off paparazzi. The strict non-disclosure agreements imposed on every housekeeper, contractor and landscaper who had ever set foot on the grounds were called reasonable private. That is exactly what made it so effective as a cover story. The estate sat behind solid stone walls, screened by dense pine and juniper, invisible from the nearest public road. Decades of deliberate isolation had normalized every defensive measure. By the time Hackman fully withdrew from public life, the compound was less famous as a celebrity retreat than it was effective as a controlled perimeter. Nobody who drove past ever thought twice about it. Then the first federal forensics team walked through the front door, pulled the real behavioral timeline off the estate security, servers, and every clean assumption they had arrived with began to collapse. Not panic architecture. Medical investigators had established the public timeline. Betsy died 7 days before Gene. The official line held that Hackman, deep in the progression of Alzheimer's, simply did not understand his wife had passed. The security data told a different story. For those 7 days, the estate's telecommunication system recorded 0 outgoing calls, no emergency services, no family, no doctor. The cause of death for Mr. Gene Hackman, aged 95 years, is hypertensive and atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, with Alzheimer's disease as a significant contributory factor. A 95-year-old man with documented cardiac disease sat inside a sealed compound with his wife's body for a full week and never once reached for the phone. Stop and picture this. On the exact day Betsy died, Hackman walked to the central security panel with a hand that, according to his own medical file, could no longer reliably hold a fork. He manually entered the administrator code. He disabled every internal camera in the house. Then he walked back across that panel and locked the outer perimeter, alarms at maximum sensitivity. The timestamp on that sequence is recorded down to the second. He did not pause between actions. He did not retry an entry. He moved through the panel like a man who had rehearsed those keystrokes more times than anyone in his life had ever known about. That configuration is not panic, that is architecture. It is the deliberate blinding of one system and the calculated preservation of another. The arrangement of a man who understood exactly what he was doing and exactly what he needed to conceal. Investigators pulled the rest of the central log. Bedroom furniture had been moved from its original positions, not knocked over but lifted and shifted in measured patterns. Personal safes had been forced open from the inside. Behavioral analysts reviewing the data were unambiguous. This was not emotional disorientation. It was the signature of a deliberate containment process, and the timing of every action mapped to a sequence Hackman appeared to have memorized long before that week began. That detail alone forced federal agents to go deeper, literally what LAR found. LiDAR scanning equipment and thermal imaging arrays were deployed across the property. The technology bounces, high-speed laser pulses off every surface and measures return time with extraordinary precision, mapping hidden voids beneath a structure without disturbing the ground above. Here the beams were pointed straight down through the floor of a dead man's house. On the very first scan, the system flagged deep thermal anomaly extending from behind the wall of Hackman's private library, dropping through dozens of meters of bedrock. Agents cross-referenced the result against county civil planning records. The structure, LiDAR had just mapped in perfect detail, did not appear anywhere in any civil planning record on file. It had never been registered. It had never been disclosed during construction or any renovation. On paper, it did not exist. If you want to stay with this investigation as more details surface, because the forensic findings only get stranger from here, and the DNA evidence you came for is what reframes everything. Subscribe now and hit the bell. New developments are still emerging. On February 26th, the couple were discovered dead by maintenance workers. Officials did not find any signs of forced entry but considered the circumstances suspicious enough to warrant a thorough investigation. The entrance was concealed behind a bookshelf. The mechanism was the part that stopped the team. No biometric scanner, no electronic switch, no wireless signal of any kind. What secured the passage was a purely mechanical locking system embedded directly into wooden steel, requiring a precise sequence of physical actions performed entirely by hand. The system generated no radio frequency signature. It functioned during a complete power failure. It was immune to remote monitoring or detection. Whoever engineered that entrance built it for permanence, for secrecy, for resilience, under conditions most homeowners would never plan for. Agents stepped through the opening and began to descend. The tunnel's upper section was reinforced with poured concrete and steel beams. Dr. Marcus Elford, a structural engineer attached to the Federal Forensic Response Team, examined the rivet spacing under his lamp and went quiet. He stood there for several seconds, without speaking, one hand still resting against the concrete, his thumb tracing the head of a single rivet as if confirming what his eyes had already told him. The poor method and rivet configuration matched military-grade security construction standards from the 1950s. In 30 years of structural assessment, he told the lead investigator he had only seen that pattern in 2 other places. Both were classified federal installations. At a depth of roughly 40 feet, everything changed. The concrete stopped. The steel beams disappeared. What replaced them were rough stone walls carved with thousands of primitive tool marks. The temperature dropped sharply. The air carried a metallic taste. The team's atmospheric monitors registered as oxidized particulate, suspended and undisturbed. The hand-carved core was not modern core. It was part of an artificial geological formation that predated the 1950s construction layered above it. It predated the estate. Someone in the middle of the 20th century had found it reinforced. It militarized it and buried the entrance beneath a private residence until the DNA came back. What the DNA confirmed. The investigation pivoted on dust, specifically on the dust pulled from the interior gears of the mechanical locking system. Special forensic technician Raymond Voss, attached to the Federal Evidence Team out of Albuquerque, examined the library mechanism under magnification. He had been told to look for anything inconsistent with long-term disuse. What he found made him set down his instruments before writing a word of his report. The metallic abrasion marks on the interior gears were fresh. Not months old, not years old, days old. Aligning with forensic precision to the 7-day window between Betsy's death and Gene's. Here's what that means. And Aaron Betsy was 30 years younger than Gan and appeared to be his caretaker. So when she died, it appears there's no one to care for him. The medical examiner says that he did not have any food in his stomach when he died. The DNA Voss recovered from those gears was Hackman's. His skin cells, his sweat, his biological signature pressed into the metal during the final week of his life, when official medical opinion had him bedridden and disoriented in grief. The man who could no longer reliably hold a fork had operated that lock with his own hands repeatedly. That is the first half of the title's promise. The DNA on the gears does not just place Hackman in the tunnel. It places him there during a window when, by every public account, he should have been incapable of reaching the bookshelf, let alone disengaging a heavy mechanical bolt array. It works against him because it dismantles the cover story of a confused old man dying in shock. He was not confused, he was working. The second DNA finding altered the character of the investigation entirely. Organic material recovered from the deepest section of the chamber far below the gear assembly Voss had just sampled produced biological readings that did not match any expected profile. Not Hackman, not Arakawa, not any decades-old contamination consistent with an old bunker. The material indicated active exposure to biological conditions that should not exist in an isolated subterranean space beneath a private estate. Sources close to the forensic team have confirmed only this much. The deep chamber DNA findings triggered an immediate escalation. The case was pulled out of the standard investigative track within hours and routed through the highest classification level available. Not historical curiosity, active ongoing concern. The organic material had no innocent explanation. Its presence confirmed the tunnel had not been dormant. Something biological had been active in that space recently, and Hackman's own DNA on the locking gears proved he had been the one operating the door, the chamber below. When the full team reached the base of the tunnel, they entered a chamber that dismantled every framework they had brought with them. The natural stone floor had been deliberately leveled. Its surface was engraved with a complex system of astronomical coordinates, a precise mapping of planetary orbits that implied mathematical knowledge inconsistent with casual private use. The carved lines were deep-weathered at the edges, but the dust inside each groove had been recently cleared. Someone had been cleaning the engravings. Wooden crates were scattered across the floor containing metallurgical components of unknown origin. Many cast as single solid pieces with no welding seams, a manufacturing method with no precedent in documented early 20th century metalwork. None of that was what stopped the room. Embedded along the rough stone wall, secured with corrosion-resistant brackets, was a closed-circuit communication system. A thick coaxial cable, insulated with dense industrial rubber, penetrated through the wall above and ran through dozens of meters of bedrock before terminating in the chamber below. Electrical Systems Analyst Dr. Claire Souza, on secondment from a Federal Infrastructure Assessment Unit, was brought in to evaluate the circuit. She traced the power source to a localized alkaline battery array operating completely independently of the estate's electrical grid above. Sized to run without interruption even during a total surface power failure. She lifted her hand from the casing slowly. The way someone touches a thing they recognize from a place they are not allowed to talk about. One of the most deliberate pieces of electrical infrastructure she had assessed outside of a classified facility. She told her colleagues, "Stop and picture this." The system was active. Its protective casing showed clear evidence of regular cleaning and recent maintenance. And Hackman's DNA again came up on the casing brackets and the battery housing. When Sousa dismantled the connectors, she found no microphone, no speaker, no mechanism for voice communication in either direction. The cable terminated in a large mechanical signal transducer, a device whose only function was to be pressed against solid surfaces and capture extremely low-frequency vibrations, pressure fluctuations, subtle movements traveling through the dense stone walls, converted into electrical signals transmitted upward through the buried cable directly to a concealed monitoring speaker inside Hackman's private living quarters above. For an unknown number of years, Hackman had not simply been living in that estate. He had been stationed there listening not to voices, not to broadcasts, not to the outside world, to the vibrations of whatever was pressing against the far side of a sealed wall 40 feet below his bedroom floor. The door sealed from outside at the terminal end of that analog cable, bonded with industrial epoxy to the deepest structure at the farthest wall of the chamber where the cavern narrowed into an unnatural constriction, was a massive iron door. It was not modern ballistic material. It was carbon steel, weathered by considerable age, completely flat. No external handle, no mechanical lock, no electronic keypad, no visible hinges on either face. Every seam along its perimeter had been sealed with continuous weld lines, unbroken permanent, applied entirely from the exterior. The welds themselves had been redressed at some point in the recent past. Not opened, not breached, reinforced. Someone had been adding to them, sealing them tighter on a maintenance cycle. This is the detail that broke the investigative framework. A bunker door is built to protect those inside from intrusion. The handle, the bolt, the hinges all exist, so the people inside maintain control. They can open it, they can exit. A door welded shut from the exterior with no mechanism on either face follows a completely different logic. Not built to protect, it is built to contain. When that single detail reached the federal investigators, it inverted the entire narrative of the estate above. The towering stone walls, the confidentiality agreements that legally erased every employee from public record, the total isolation from the surrounding road network. They were known to be very private people who kept themselves and their 3 dogs at a $3 million property in a quiet, secluded part of Santa Fe. Hackman's disabling of his own internal cameras in the hours following his wife's death, assembled in the light of that welded steel door, none of those measures read like the privacy precautions of a famous man tired of cameras. He was not protecting himself from the world. He was protecting this world from whatever existed on the other side. For years, possibly for the last 2 decades of his life, Hackman had been the sole civilian warden of a geological containment structure. The estate's perimeter prevented accidental access. The analog cable and the monitoring speaker tracked the rhythm of whatever the iron door was holding back. And now his DNA on the locks on the cable brackets, on the battery housing, confirmed it had not been a passive arrangement. He had been maintaining the system personally until the week he died. Federal authorities had plasma cutting equipment on site, industrial-grade tools capable of breaching any steel structure within minutes. Not a single agent was authorized to activate them. Specialists stood before that rusted door, analyzed the weld lines, documented the astronomical map carved into the floor, and made one decision. Everything stays sealed. They refused to open what one man had spent his life keeping closed, and the speed of the lockdown that followed the convoys, the FOIA denials. The disappearance of municipal complaint records dating back to 2019 about a low-frequency vibration emanating from underground 2 in the morning confirmed the same thing. The government had not discovered something new. It was reclaiming a known asset which left the most disturbing question of the case still on the table. What had Hackman actually been doing in there during the final 7 days of his life? The final 7 days. The DNA on the gears answers that question. And once you see the answer, you cannot unsee it. When the micro-forensic evidence, the biological trace on the locking mechanism, the listening cable, and the sealed welded door are examined together, Hackman's silence in the week following Betsy's death stops being explainable as grief or psychological collapse. It was a security protocol executed to its absolute limit by a man who understood exactly what failure would cost. The moment Betsy took her last breath, his failing heart was confronted with an unforgiving calculation. Betsy was her husband's main caretaker in his final years, and you can see that in the notes that she left for Hackman in their home. A single emergency call would have triggered an unstoppable chain reaction. Local police, emergency responders, forensic teams, media people with no knowledge of the containment system, no awareness of the tunnel, no understanding of what was sealed 40 feet below the library floor. They would inevitably reach the bookshelf. Ordinary curiosity, not malice, just the instinct of investigators doing their jobs, could have disrupted the locking sequence, interrupted the signal line, or drawn attention to the iron door. He made a choice. Picture him in those last days. A 95-year-old man with cardiac disease alone in a silent house with the body of his wife. The only sound, the low-frequency rhythm of the monitoring speaker in his private quarters. He disabled the internal cameras. He walked to the library. He pulled the bookshelf open with arms that by every medical assessment should not have managed it. His breath was audible in the empty hallway, slow and shallow, catching at the top of each inhale. His hand trembled on the mechanical lock and left the trace evidence Voss would later find on the gears. The dust on the gear surface was so fine that the abrasion pattern preserved every individual finger placement, every grip adjustment, every moment his strength gave out, and he had to reset his hand and try again. He descended the stone steps one last time. He operated the heavy locks. He verified that the containment remained intact. He returned to the surface inside the sealed, silent house with the speaker still transmitting from the bedrock below. He sat down and listened until his own heartbeat finally stopped. That is what the DNA proves. Not that he was confused, not that he was overwhelmed, that he was working to the very end with the methodical precision of a man who had performed the same protocol many times before, and understood that this would be the last time anyone he had ever trusted would perform it at all. The incident in Santa Fe was closed without public explanation. The anomalous engineering, the astronomical coordinates, the deep chamber, DNA, the active analog circuit. None of it was ever going to be resolved through a standard investigation. It was managed, transferred, buried a second time beneath classification protocols rather than bedrock. Control passed from the trembling hands of one aging civilian into the silent machinery of a government apparatus that had never fully walked away. The agents withdrew. The LiDAR systems were packed and removed. The estate vanished from accessible public record. Beneath the bedrock, the corroded iron door remains its welds unbroken. Far below the surface of the Santa Fe Desert, that low-frequency vibration continues its mechanical rhythm, exactly as it did when Gene Hackman was still alive to hear it. Whatever he spent a lifetime listening to is still there. Only the one who listens has been replaced. If this story raised more questions than it answered, subscribe for more investigations that go where the official record stops. New videos every